What's up, my friends? It's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and today we're going to talk about the Cleveland Browns. The Cleveland Browns are an American football team that has been around since the beginning of our big football league here in this country, but they've got a goofy past because after being really successful in the early years, they won multiple championships just when football was getting off the ground in this country. They went through kind of a dry spell, mostly at the hands of John Elway and the Denver Broncos, who repeatedly broke their hearts and smashed their hopes against the rocks. And that carried over into the 1990s, and their owner, Art Modell, in, 1995-ish, decided that he was going to pack up the beloved, age-old Cleveland Browns, the pride of the city of Cleveland, and pack them up and move them to Baltimore. The Browns, their helmet, their logo, their team history, all of that stuff, it went into mothballs for 3 or 4 years. And Art Modell, the owner of the franchise, was allowed to pack up all of his players and staff and personnel and probably footballs and equipment and maybe some bags or hats or something and move the whole thing to Baltimore. The new team in Baltimore would have a new name and they would be a new thing, the Baltimore Ravens. But are they really a new thing or are they the old thing? Did Baltimore adopt the Browns and now the Browns play in Baltimore? Well, that's a hard question as it is, but it gets even more complicated when the 3 or 4 year mothball period for the people of Cleveland and the old Browns logo and everything passed. Now the Cleveland Browns came back into circulation and start effectively from scratch after having 4 years off, and they never recovered. They've been kicked around by the league ruthlessly for years since, maybe having some glimmers of hope as I record this, but it's been a rough go for the historic Cleveland Browns and a pretty good go for the relocated Cleveland Browns, now called the Baltimore Ravens. They've had multiple championships, legendary defenses. You got to tip your hat. It's a good franchise. So who are the Browns? Were they relocated and replaced? Was a new franchise born? Who owns the history and legacy of that franchise? It gets a little bit confusing. And likewise, when people who look at the Bible try to make sense of what we were talking about yesterday, that is Israel, and they compare that with this new family of faith that we see all over the New Testament as the message of Jesus goes out to the Gentiles and as people who are not ethnically Jewish at all, not participatory in the Jewish religion, people who have no ownership of Jewish history or even awareness of any of that stuff, as these people become followers of Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, the God of Abraham, but also the God of the Trinity, the God who shows up at Jesus' baptism, and the God who put together the whole plan, and the God who Jesus refers to as his Father, and the God who Jesus says, you've seen the Father, you've seen me, you've seen me, you've seen the Father, that is, and the God who Jesus points to and says, this is my Father's house, when he goes and cleans the whole thing up in chapter 21 of the book of Matthew. People all around the world, starting in the 1st century AD, after the events we're reading about in the book of Matthew right now, they start to worship this God. And they view Jesus as being the son of this God and God in the flesh. And also you have ethnic Jewish people who look at the historical scriptures of the Old Testament and would say, no, Jesus was a fake Messiah. The stuff in the Old Testament, that's accurate. There are promises in there from God. And those promises from God, those are for us, and they're yet to be completely fulfilled. But then there are Christians who look at that and they would say, yes, there are all of those promises that are there in the Old Testament, but they are fulfilled in the church, in Christianity, in God's new chosen people. And then there are other Christians who would look at that and say, nah, these are two distinct things, but what happens to Israel? If we can crack the code of what the prophecies of the Bible mean about Israel, then we can crack the code of how things will unfold in the end times, and we can figure out on a calendar right where we are right now and how everything's going to work out and who needs to be elected president and what boundaries of what country need to be drawn which way to make it so that God can come back. And then there are other people who are like, I don't know. It looks like there's something unique about God's relationship with Israel, but it also looks like that overlaps and shares territory with God's relationship with the church, his new family of faith, this family of faith through which the salvation that is being described in the book of Matthew through Jesus is happening. Look, if you are overwhelmed by the Cleveland Browns thing and you're like, I don't know if the Browns or the Ravens or the Browns, it's weird. Like, can there be two? Are they both sort of in a way? If you're confused by that, and you're confused by this question about God's chosen people, his old family of faith and his new family of faith, Israel and the church in the Bible, then you are in good company. This is one of the most difficult things that we come up against theologically in all of Christianity, in all of the Bible. You will run into people from time to time who are like, what? No, it's not hard at all. I solved it. And if you'll simply come to my basement and look at my yarn and newspaper clippings and thumbtacks that I have underneath this fluorescent light, you'll see that it's all easily solved in just 84 simple moves if you just carefully look at history and you read everything exactly this precise way that I read it. The truth of the matter is it is a hard question. It's supposed to be a hard question. And one of the points of intrigue / frustration that I feel when I look at this one is that just about every other theology thing that we run into in the Bible, I feel like we're not given a ton of wiggle room. Like, I get how you could see it kind of one way or the other way a little bit, but the gist is pretty evident, except for this. I think there's a lot of ways to read this one. I get why people come to different conclusions, but I also think if you look carefully, there are certain things that whatever position you craft or wherever somebody lands on the question of what is Israel and what is the church and how do they relate together and what is God doing with both of them moving forward, wherever you land on that, I think there are a handful of things that the Bible teaches and that you have to take into account when considering what you do with this question. Why are we talking about all of this right now? Well, the reality is we're coming to a point in the last third, Act 3 of the book of Matthew, where this stuff is inevitable. This is the question. We're being forced into a place where we decide how we interpret Matthew. Is Matthew an explanation of God's previous work and how Jesus is the completion of that previous work and how moving forward there is a new thing that will happen? That would be my dun-dun-dun-dun-dun Jesus interpretation of the whole thing. And understandably, there's a sociological aspect to that as well about, well, what does that mean for people who are already Jewish in this giant paradigm shift that doesn't seem to mean much to us now because we're 2,000 years after the fact, but at the time, it would have been absolutely world-jarring. And so it's all there. This transcendent theology of the salvation and deity of Christ is there, and also the sociological realities, the theological realities of this first century Judaism read on how the world and religion are, and the conflict that's naturally going to feel with Jesus as the fulfillment of that religion. If you're wondering if I'm trying to persuade you right now, the answer is yes. I have my full persuasion motivation on. I'm disclosing that to you right now. But let me just appeal to this instead of some clever argument. Come on, you've been here with me. You've looked at this with your own eyes for 2 years if you've been here since the beginning. You've been looking at all of this stuff. Does it read like a simple sociological description of conflict between two expressions of religion? Or does it read like it is moving past that friction, pushing it to the side, and moving towards something much, much bigger than that, with much grander implications? I think it's obviously the latter. Cognizant of the friction between historic Judaism and where Jesus and Christianity are going? Yes, absolutely. But much, much, much more than that is going on here. There's so much more than that contained in the teachings of Jesus. And indeed, if Jesus is right, then what he's saying is all of that stuff from the past, it doesn't go away. It's not useless. Instead, it is Matthew 5:17. It is fulfilled. It is completed in Jesus. And why would it be such unless this is still going somewhere forward? There's an actual into the future trajectory that Jesus is creating with his work there. And unapologetically, as we've been reading through it, I've come to that conclusion all over again, working through the book of Matthew with you. And I know that there are some of you going through this who might take more of that sociological view, that no, everything here is Matthew grappling with this historic friction, and there is no further implication to it. It's just an interesting snapshot of an inflection moment in the history of religion. And if that does happen to be where you come down on it, well, I'm glad that we get to think about this together, even though I disagree with your read on the text. Every now and then when we work through a big chunk of Bible like this, we run into a theological buzzsaw, an incredibly difficult question that if we don't think about it and frame it up on the front end, then as we get a little bit further into it, which we're going to do in chapter 22, and as we get into what's called the Olivet Discourse, the final of those great big speeches of Jesus around which the book of Matthew is structured, when we get into that stuff, if we don't have some context for how to think about this together, if we're not aware of the different things that people make of this question about Israel and the church and which is which and where we go from here, then it gets really tricky and we're not setting ourselves up for success. So that's why you're getting this little aside here as we're sitting here on this pivot point lingering between chapters 21 and 22. So we'll try to land the plane on that mañana, and we'll look specifically at, I think, the three main positions that people who read the Bible take regarding what to make of the question of Israel and the church and how they relate and where it's going for both of those groups moving forward. Thanks for being up for patiently doing our very best to do this the right way together. I appreciate you. I'm Matt. This is the 10 Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.